Okay, let's unpack this. The life story of a person credited with saving hundreds of millions of lives, more than anyone else in history, for work he did in agriculture.
It's an incredible thought, isn't it? Not a general, not a doctor, but a plant scientist.
Today we're doing a deep dive into the life and legacy of Dr. Norman Borlaug, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, who launched what we now call the Green Revolution. Our sources trace his journey from an Iowa farm boy all the way to a global humanitarian.
And he was the architect of modern high-yield farming. It's a story that involves, not just scientific genius, but just this immense personal grit.
So our mission today is to really get into the source material and pull out what made him so effective. The breakthroughs, sure, but also the policy battles, the personal philosophy that let one man's passion for wheat change the calorie equation for billions.
And to really set the stage, we have to start with the moment the world sort of woke up to what he'd done. It's a scene that just perfectly captures the man. Let's go to the morning of October 20, 1970.
Right. It's before daybreak in Mexico City. The phone starts ringing off the hook. Calls are flooding in from Oslo, Norway. Norman's wife, Margaret Borlaug, is the one taking these calls.
And she's completely baffled. The reporters on the line are insistent, but she thinks it has to be some kind of elaborate hoax.
Because what they're telling her is that the chairman of the Nobel Selection Committee is about to announce that her husband has won the Nobel Peace Prize.
The Peace Prize, that's what's so shocking. We think of diplomats, activists, people who broker treaties.
Exactly. But the Nobel Committee's logic was that his breakthroughs in wheat production had relieved so much hunger and suffering that they directly contributed to global stability and peace. It's a powerful argument.
And there's no Nobel Prize for food or agriculture, so the Peace Prize was the only vehicle they had to recognize this massive contribution to humanity. He was actually the only person in the 20th century to win it for agriculture.
But the man himself, the new laureate, he's nowhere to be found. He's not available for comment.
So Margaret realizes she has to go find him. She gets a car and driver and heads out on these terrible muddy roads toward the Toluca Agricultural Experiment Station, which is about 30 miles outside the city.
And when she gets there, she finds him exactly where you'd expect. Deep in the field, bent over, working alongside his small team.
A real international crew, two Romanians, a Brazilian, an American, two Mexicans, all of them just sweaty, covered in mud, totally absorbed in what they're doing.
They were in a frantic race against the calendar. And this is where the story gets so good. Margaret pulls him aside and breaks the news that he's won the Nobel Peace Prize.
And Norman's first reaction is just disbelief, dismissal even. He says something like, no, that can't be, Margaret. Someone's pulling your leg.
And then he turns around and goes right back to work. Right back to selecting wheat plants in the mud. He just dismisses the single greatest honor of his entire life.
That moment, it just encapsulates everything about him. They were under this incredible pressure. They had 8,000 individual selections they had to examine, harvest, and pack.
An unbelievable number.
And they were on a hard deadline. They had to get those seeds planted in their winter nursery down in Sonora by November 1st. For Borlaug, the Nobel, well, it was an interruption. The science couldn't wait. The threat of famine was real, and, paperwork and prizes could always wait.
So we have to ask, how does a person forge that kind of just unrelenting drive? To understand that, you have to go all the way back to the beginning, back to a small Norwegian-American farming community in Iowa called Soda.
Little Norway, they called it. Borlaug was born there in 1914, and his childhood was really defined by that kind of hard-nosed, subsistence farming frugality.
His education started in a one-teacher, one-room schoolhouse, New Oregon Township number 8. It was the same building his father and grandfather had gone to.
Think about that. Not much had changed in 3 generations. Our sources say that writing paper was often so scarce they had to write their lessons on slate boards with chalk.
And academically, he was not what you'd call a prodigy. He actually flunked the university entrance exam. He said later in life he'd failed it beautifully.
Right, and his big ambition back then wasn't saving the world. He wanted to be a high school science teacher and a coach. A solid, respected, small-town job.
But that foundation for his later determination, that was being laid at home. The family was poor in terms of money, but they were incredibly resourceful. They never went hungry.
No, they had a system. The farm was this integrated unit. They grew corn and oats to fatten their pigs and steers. They'd sell the cream to the local co-op and trade eggs at the general store for things like sugar and flour.
A self-sustaining model based on sheer hard work.
And the philosophical force behind it all was his grandfather, Nels Borlaug. Nels was constantly drilling the value of education into young Norman.
He had these great sticky phrases. Things like, Norm boy, it's better to fill your head now if you want to fill your belly later.
And the other one, the big one, was education and common sense, thinking things out for yourself. That's what matters. He'd say, get yourself a good education. No one can take that away from you.
That grounding in practical wisdom was crucial. But his motivation, the thing that really lit the fire, that came during the Great Depression.
The Borlaugs actually did better than most because they were disciplined and critically debt-free. His father had wisely refused to borrow money to build a new barn.
But the crisis was all around them. I mean, the system was just collapsing. The sources say that between 1920 and 1933, 1 out of every 4 farms in the country was sold because of debts or taxes.
And when Norman enrolled at the University of Minnesota in 1933, that crisis stopped being an abstract farm problem. It became urban, and it became visceral.
He saw real systemic hunger for the first time in his life. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, he saw hundreds of unemployed people begging for nickels, sleeping in parks.
The hunger for food and hunger for work, as he put it, and those images, they just burned themselves into his memory. It gave him a determination that went way beyond just wanting to be a high school coach.
So even with that bumpy academic start, flunking the exam and being placed in the general college, he was driven. He eventually convinced an assistant director, Dr. Fred Hovde, to let him transfer into the College of Agriculture to study forestry.
A critical moment. Borlaug always said he wouldn't have become a scientist if Hovde hadn't given him that chance.
And then comes the first major detour. He had a job lined up as a junior forester in Idaho, but right before he was supposed to start in late 1937, the position was canceled. Budget cuts.
He was completely adrift, and that could have been the end of his scientific career right there.
But his future wife, Margaret Gibson, who he'd met in a coffee shop at the university, she stepped in. She persuaded him to stay and go to grad school.
And she supported them both. She worked as a proofreader while he studied. She provided that stability he needed to keep going.
And that led him to his other great mentor, Dr. E.C. Steakman. They had a plant pathology. Steakman specialized in rusts, these parasitic fungi that devastate crops.
Steakman was apparently this incredible lecturer. He described wheat rust as a shifty, changing, constantly evolving enemy. That phrase just stuck with Borlaug for his entire life. It became his framework for the battle ahead.
And it was Stockman who nudged him away from forest pathology toward general plant pathology, arguing it would give him more flexibility.
So you have this series of, near misses and interventions, the canceled job, Marbit's support, Stockman's guidance. It all conspired to steer him away from the forests and toward the grain fields that would end up defining his life's work.
And that purpose really came into focus in 1944. He took what was probably the biggest risk of his career. He was working a safe, well-paying job at DuPont, making a good living.
Very good living, about $2,800 a year. And he gave it all up to take this huge gamble with the Mexican Government Rockefeller Foundation Cooperative Agricultural Program.
The idea came from Henry Wallace, the vice president-elect. Wallace was deeply concerned about Mexico's food shortages. He saw that the land reforms after the revolution had failed because the farmers, the campesinos, they had the land, but they didn't have the knowledge, the seeds, or the money to make it productive.
So Borlaug accepts this job, having never been to Mexico. He doesn't speak a word of Spanish. He's leaving total security for a complete unknown.
And it was all because of those images from the Depression, those hungry people in the parks. He saw this as his chance to finally do something about systemic hunger.
The conditions he found when he arrived were, they were dire. The program director had a piece of land, but there was no equipment, no infrastructure.
Right. Farm equipment was a wartime priority in the U.S., so you couldn't get any. Gas and tires were almost impossible to find. Borlaug's first office was literally an adobe shed with a tar paper roof.
They were starting from absolute zero, but his mandate was revolutionary. He wasn't supposed to be an advisor sitting in an office. He was supposed to be a working scientist.
Getting his hands and boots dirty.
Exactly. And that immediately caused this huge cultural clash. In Mexico at the time, a scientist was a limpio saco, a clean shirt, an intellectual who advised from a distance. They didn't do manual labor.
And Borlaug just wouldn't have it. He apparently lost his temper over and over, insisting that if they didn't understand the work in the field themselves, they couldn't possibly give farmers useful advice.
He was fighting bureaucracy and cultural inertia from the moment he arrived. Once he got to the wheat program, he zeroed in on the single biggest biological problem. He called it the lodging barrier.
Okay, so let's break this down. The traditional Mexican wheat varieties were really tall and slender.
Right. And if you tried to apply heavy nitrogen fertilizer to them to get more grain, the plants would just grow taller, become top-heavy with the grain, and then a strong wind or rain would come and they'd just fall over. That's lodging.
So all that potential yield just rotting in the field.
Precisely. It was a biological ceiling. The farmers wouldn't use the fertilizer because it was too risky. Borlaug realized he couldn't just fix this with better farming practices. He had to physically re-engineer the wheat plant itself.
And that realization is what kicks off his three great innovations. The first was this relentless focus on rust resistance.
Just like his mentor Stackman had taught him, rust was a shifty, changing enemy. So he started screening thousands of varieties from all over the world, looking for genes that could resist the multiple strains of rust in Mexico. It was a constant, ongoing battle.
The second innovation was the big one, the strategic game changer, shuttle breeding. This is his speed hack.
It was incredibly audacious. You know, traditional plant breeding takes 6 or 7 years to develop one new variety because you can only grow one generation a year.
Borlaug's idea was to grow 2 generations a year. He proposed shuttling the seeds between 2 completely different experimental stations.
One was up in the high altitudes of Toluca, over 8,000 feet, with a summer growing season and short days. The other was way down at sea level in the Yaqui Valley, with a winter growing season and long days.
So this wasn't just about saving time, though it cut the breeding cycle in half. It had this incredible accidental side effect.
This is the absolute key to the whole story. By forcing the wheat to grow and thrive in these 2 radically different environments, different altitudes, soils, temperatures, and most importantly, different day lengths, he inadvertently created wheat that was photoinsensitive.
Meaning it didn't rely on the length of the day to trigger its growth stages like flowering?
Exactly. Most temperate wheat is very sensitive to that. If you take wheat from Iowa and plant it near the equator where the days are always short, it gets confused and fails. But Borlaug's wheat had been selected to work in both long day and short day environments. It just ignored the signal.
And that single trait is what allowed it to be planted all over the world, from Mexico to India to Pakistan.
It was the secret ingredient. And then the third innovation was solving that lodging problem with what he called dwarf wheat architecture.
He went on a global search for the genes for shortness. He eventually got seeds of a Japanese dwarf variety called Norin 10 from a USDA scientist.
And he started crossing that dwarf gene into his best Mexican varieties. The result was a totally new kind of plant, short, very sturdy, with a stiff straw.
And when you poured the fertilizer on this new plant,
it didn't fall over. It took all that nitrogen and put it into producing more grain. The potential yields just exploded. They went from around 4,500 kilograms per hectare to a potential of 9,000.
the results were stunning. Mexico basically doubled its national wheat yields in about 7 years and became self-sufficient.
But we can't stress enough how hard he had to fight for these ideas, especially shuttle breeding. His bosses, the program director George Harrar and the advisory committee, they hated the idea.
They thought it was too risky, too expensive. They said the real problem, the guts of the problem, was with the poor farmers in the high valleys, not in some distant commercial farming area.
They voted the plan down twice. It was dead in the water.
And this is where that Iowa stubbornness comes in.
Yeah.
Borlaug basically went to Harrar and gave him an ultimatum.
He did. He said, if this is a firm decision, I also make a firm decision. You will have to find someone else to conform to your rules. He was ready to resign.
He was willing to walk away from everything rather than compromise on the science.
It was a huge moment. And what saved it was 2 things happening at once. His old mentor, Stackman, happened to be visiting, and he intervened. And at the same time, a letter arrived from a prominent farmer in the Yaqui Valley praising Borlaug's new, wonderful wheat.
The combination of his mentor's support and proof from the field was enough. Harrar finally gave in and approved the plan. And the rest, as they say, is history.
But it's a history that could have gone a very different way if that letter had arrived a day later.
So that success in Mexico, it suddenly becomes globally important in the early 1960s because the world was starting to panic about food.
Yeah, the Malthusian fears were back in a big way. The idea that population growth would just swamp our ability to produce food. And if you looked at the numbers, it seemed plausible.
Especially in Asia. India was trying to feed a population 2.5 times bigger than all of Latin America on a tiny fraction of the land. It was a ticking time bomb.
And you saw this reflected in books at the time. The Paddock brothers wrote a book called Famine, 1975, where they literally argued that countries like India were a lost cause and should just be abandoned.
And of course, Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, which made the same argument that food production just couldn't keep up.
So against this backdrop of global panic, Borlaug starts exporting his Mexican wheat. In 64 and 65, he sends hundreds of tons of seed to Pakistan and India for testing.
This was the big test. Would the photoinsensitive wheat actually work on another continent?
And it did. The results were spectacular. The farmers were ecstatic, but only if, and this is the critical part, only if they used the whole technology package. The new seed, plus fertilizer, plus water.
So Borlaug's work suddenly transitions from being about science to being about global politics.
And the political risks were huge. The Indian Minister of Food and Agriculture, C. Subramaniam, made what our sources call a courageous and historic decision.
He decided to import 18,000 tons of Mexican wheat seed. 18,000 tons. He was betting his entire political career on this foreign grain.
And the demand from farmers who saw the test plots was just explosive. They had to put armed guards around the fields where they were multiplying the seed because farmers were trying to steal it.
A black market for Mexican wheat seed sprung up overnight.
But Borlaug knew the seed was only half the battle. The other half was policy. He understood that the biggest barriers now weren't biological, they were bureaucratic.
And he was not shy about telling them. In 1967, he stood up in front of a room full of dignitaries and press and told them exactly what they needed to do.
He didn't mince words. He famously repeated the same 3 demands 3 times each just to hammer the point home. Fertilizer, 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 credit, 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 and fair prices, fair prices, fair prices.
Okay, let's unpack that. Why those 3 things?
Well, fertilizer was obvious. The dwarf wheat was hungry. It needed the nutrients to reach its potential. Credit was because small farmers couldn't afford the seed and fertilizer up front.
And the fair prices.
That was the most important part. If a farmer took the risk, bought the seed, bought the fertilizer, and grew a massive crop, but then the government flooded the market with cheap food aid from America, the price would crash. The farmer would be ruined. There would be no incentive to plant again the next year.
He saw the whole economic system. But that bluntness created political problems. Subramaniam, his main champion, actually lost his seat in Congress the next month.
So before he left office, Subramaniam arranged one last critical meeting for Borlaug. He got him in a room with the Deputy Prime Minister, Ashok Mehta, the man who controlled fertilizer imports.
And Borlaug just laid into him. He argued that relying on American food aid was a trap. It was politically unreliable. He said India had to prioritize fertilizer production over everything else, even heavy industry.
That meeting was a turning point. It helped shift Indian economic policy. The government started to guarantee stable prices, provide credit, and import massive amounts of fertilizer. They created the conditions for the technology to succeed.
The psychological impact was huge, too. Subramaniam dug up his personal cricket pitch to plant the new wheat. The Prime Minister planted it in her flower bed.
It was a massive public endorsement, and the results were immediate. Pakistan was self-sufficient in wheat by 1968. India was self-sufficient by 1972.
The famine was averted. The Malthusian predictions were just wrong.
And that's when a USAID administrator named William Gott coined the term. He contrasted this victory with the Cold War, calling it not a red revolution or a white revolution, but the green revolution. And the name stuck.
The success in Asia proved that Borlaug's model worked. But the next challenge was how to institutionalize it. How do you create a permanent global system to keep this progress going?
The first step was actually taken even before the big India success. The International Rice Research Institute, or IRI, was set up in the Philippines in 1962, modeled directly on Borlaug's program in Mexico.
Because rice was the other half of the food equation in Asia.
Exactly. And IRI quickly developed miracle rice, the IR8 variety, which was also a short, sturdy, high-yield plant. That was the second half of the Green Revolution.
Borlaug's own program was formalized in 1966 as MMYT, the International Center for Maize and Wheat Improvement.
And its core mission was just so radical for the time. It wasn't about patents or profits. The mission was to make all of its data, all of its seeds, and all of its knowledge available to the entire world free of charge.
Open source science for humanity.
And a huge part of that was training. Within 20 years, CMYT had trained 4,000 researchers from over 100 countries. It created a global network of scientists who understood Borlaug's hands-on, field-based approach.
The success of CMYT and IRI created demand for more centers, for other crops in other regions, and that led to a really important meeting in 1969, the Bellagio Conference in Italy.
This was the meeting that secured the whole system's future. You had the heads of the World Bank, like Robert McNamara, UN agencies, major foundations, all in one room.
And what convinced them to fund it on a massive scale?
Cold, hard numbers. The research directors showed them the data. The rate of return on the investment in rice research was over 50%.
That's an incredible number for any investment.
It's unbelievable. When McNamara saw that, he basically said, we'll help you raise whatever money you need. And that commitment led to the creation of the CGIR, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research.
So that's the umbrella organization that manages the whole global network of research centers to this day. It's probably the biggest institutional legacy of the Green Revolution.
It is. And yet, even with all that success, the Nobel Prize, Borlaug felt something was missing. He kept saying, there's no Nobel Prize for food.
So he decided to create one.
He did. He spent years trying to find a sponsor for what he wanted to call the World Food Prize. It was eventually established and funded, and it's now based right in his home state of Iowa.
And it's seen as the Nobel for Food and Agriculture. But it also has this component to inspire the next generation, right? The Youth Institute.
Yes, that was so important to him, encouraging high school kids to go into food science. He was always thinking about who would carry on the fight.
So after the incredible success in Asia, Borlaug spent the last part of his career focused on the one place the Green Revolution hadn't really reached, Sub-Saharan Africa.
He saw it as the region with the greatest untapped potential, but also the greatest risk of a Malthusian disaster. So in the 1980s, he teamed up with President Jimmy Carter and a Japanese philanthropist on a new initiative.
Sasakawa Global 2000. But the challenges in Africa were just. They were on a different scale than in India.
He concluded that the food crisis in Africa was largely a result of decades of neglect of agriculture by political leaders, and crucially, a complete lack of investment in infrastructure.
He had this really stark data point he used to make that case. He'd compare paved roads per million people. In the USA, it's almost 21,000 kilometers.
And in Ethiopia, 66 kilometers.
66. It's an impossible number to even imagine.
And he was so blunt about it. He said, lack of infrastructure is killing Africa. If you can't get fertilizer to the farms cheaply, and you can't get the harvest back to the cities efficiently, the whole system breaks down. High-yield farming becomes impossible.
And yet, even with those challenges, the model still worked on a small scale. Their demonstration plots in Africa consistently yielded 2 or 3 times the national average.
It proved that technology wasn't the problem. The problem was policy and infrastructure. And Borlaug remained optimistic. He always said the Earth could feed 10 billion people.
But, and there was always a but,
If, only if, societies keep supporting research and policymakers actually listen. But as he looked at the system he helped create, he saw this deeply worrying trend in research funding.
it just cratered, right?
Right.
Agricultural aid from rich countries was cut in half in the 1990s.
Yeah, the entire budget for the CGIR network, the thing that protects the world from famine, is less than $400 million a year, the cost of a couple of stealth fighter jets. It shows you where our priorities are.
And he became a critic of the CGIR itself, didn't he? He thought it had lost its way.
He did. He said it had lost touch with its original purpose, to feed the hungry. He felt it had become this unwieldy beast that was trying to do too many things. Gender equity, environmentalism, poverty alleviation, all worthy goals, he'd say. But they were diluting the core mission.
Which for him was always about one thing.
Calories. Producing more resilient calories. For Borlaug, if you didn't solve that first, nothing else mattered.
And to produce those calories, he argued we would need to embrace new tools. Which brings us to the biotechnology debate.
A really contentious issue. But Borlaug was a pragmatist. He saw biotechnology not as something to be feared, but as a necessary new tool. He pointed to things like pest-resistant corn that reduces pesticide use, or golden rice, which is engineered to have vitamin A to fight blindness.
He saved his most pointed criticism for the activists who opposed these technologies.
Oh, he called them elitists, who had never experienced the physical sensation of hunger. He said they were lobbying from their comfortable offices to deny tools to the very farmers who needed them most.
Including chemical fertilizer, which he argued was absolutely non-negotiable for feeding the current world population, let alone a future one.
His pragmatism was just relentless. But in the final years of his life, he saw the return of his oldest enemy, the one Stackman had warned him about all those years ago.
The shifty, changing enemy, rust.
Yes. A new, extremely virulent strain of stem rust appeared in Uganda. They called it UEJ99.
And the problem was that it could overcome the resistance genes that had protected most of the world's wheat for decades.
It's an existential threat. Most of the world's wheat varieties are susceptible. If it spreads, it could cause a global harvest failure on a scale we haven't seen in our lifetimes.
Borlaug saw this as a direct result of complacency. The international rust monitoring network they had built in the 60s and 70s had been allowed to just fall apart.
Exactly. There hadn't been a big rust epidemic in 50 years, so the funding dried up, people got complacent, and the enemy, as it always does, evolved.
He spent his final years sounding the alarm, trying to rebuild that global cooperation before it was too late.
So when you look back at his entire life's work, it's this incredible fusion of science and policy, all aimed at one goal.
He had that amazing quote that summed it all up. If you desire peace, cultivate justice, but at the same time, cultivate the fields to produce more bread. Otherwise, there will be no peace.
He connected a full stomach directly to global security, but he was always so humble. He saw himself as only a catalyst. He always gave the credit to his team, and especially to his wife, Margaret, for holding everything together while he was off saving the world.
A rare combination of genius, idealism, and just a brutal impatience with anything that stood in the way of getting the job done.
And I think if there's one single lesson from this whole deep dive, it's about that cycle of success and complacency. Borlaug built a system to stay ahead of the threats. But as we see with UG-99, our vigilance is always the first thing to fade.
And that's really the provocative thought to leave you with, isn't it? Borlaug fought his whole life to stay one step ahead of the shifty, changing enemy. Now, with the new super rust threatening a global staple and huge yield gaps still waiting to be closed in Africa, is the world ready to reinvest in the long, hard, grinding work of research and cooperation?
Or will we stay complacent until the next crisis is knocking at the door? Borlaug always said you can't just admire the potential of a place like Africa. You need policy, you need investment, you need action. Because at the end of the day, you can't eat potential.